There's a broad range of specialties that exist in the study of sensation and perception. Ophthalmology is the study of the structure, function, and diseases of the eyes. Audiology is the science of hearing. Neurology is the study of the nervous system. Understanding sensation and perception requires comprehending the physical properties of the objects of our perception, light, sound, and texture of material things, and so on. So when you look at this slide, how many faces do you see hidden? This is your perception. Sensation and perception are the processes that help to shape and create our world. Sensation is the process of receiving stimulus energies from the external environment and transforming those energies into neural energy. Perception is the process of organizing and interpreting sensory information so that it makes sense to us. How we process information is through bottom-up processing or top-down processing. Bottom-up processing occurs when information from the external environment is registered and sent up to the brain for interpretation. This type of processing occurs with first-time information, meaning information that a person is not familiar with. Top-down processing occurs with higher levels of cognitive processing. Such processing occurs with information that a person is already familiar with and can create a bias in which a person overlooks a piece of information or detail that wasn't expected. This type of top-down processing influences one's expectations of others, including creating stereotypes. You can see in our example here, the cartoon clip, we have bottom-up and top-down processing. The bottom-up, we are taking in the sounds from the music. Our brain is going to interpret this music. And top-down, we're going to think about the music first, and then we're going to create some type of perceptual experience in our mind's ear. So for the Ponzo illusion, which is going to be bigger? Is it A or is it B? And so perception deals with parts of the eye, the optic nerve. And so the fovea, the blind spot, the retina, the lens, the iris, the cornea, the pupil, the ganglion cell, rods, cones, back of the eye, all of that is part of our perception, right? So size constancy is another part of this Ponzo illusion, and then there's some other illusions listed here as well. So how does the Ponzo illusion work, right? This was first demonstrated in 1913 by an Italian psychologist named Mario Ponzo. And so the reason that the top horizontal line looks longer is because we interpret the scene using what's called linear perspective. Since the vertical parallel lines seem to go closer as they move further away, we interpret the line as being further off in the distance, the top line. An object in the distance would need to be longer in order for it to appear the same size as a near object, so the top far line is seen as being longer than the bottom line that's near, even though they are considered to be the same size. And you can see that in the representations here in each of the images. The picture on the left, all three elephants are the same size. They appear to be different based on their placement and the distance that we have between them. If you look at the YouTube video that's posted in your folder this week to watch, you'll see this within cars with an SUV example, and the vehicles are moved and placed on one another, and you'll see the same representation for the Ponzo illusion. So depth cues, or perceiving depth, is what we see here. This is an example of monocular cues, but depth perception is the ability to perceive objects three-dimensionally. And so binocular cues we have, which is depth cues that depend on the combination of the images in the left and right eyes and on the way the two eyes work together. And then we have convergence, which is a binocular cue in which muscle movements in an individual's two eyes provide information about how deep and or how far something away is. And monocular cues is what the example is here in the picture, is a powerful depth cue that's available from the image in one eye, either the right or the left eye. And so there's different reasons that we see the images different here. And so that's shading, it's differential lighting, it's the relative size, right? So that obviously the person is not much shorter, but based on placement, based on the position that's, you know, relative to the horizon, the motion parallax, this linear perspective that we have, the texture gradient, you know, all of this relates to how we view the person, but we didn't, you know, just automatically shrink the person in size. It's just the placement of it in comparison to the person that's more in the forefront in the white is why we're seeing it. But it goes back to that linear perspective again. You might have heard of the visual cliff experiment. We look at this with the binocular cues. And so our eyes are aiming at the same spot every time. And so this parallax or disparity view that we see here, Eleanor Gibson did the visual cliff experiment. And so what you see here is the baby's not about to fall off the cliff, but there's plexiglass and it's just see-through. And so on the one side, the red and white checkered is high up, and on the other side it looks farther down. And so it's like this visual cliff where the babies are going to drop off. And so they tested the baby at different ages, and when the baby first starts crawling, and are they going to crawl over this visual cliff, and you know, at what age are they going to stop crawling over it? And so there's a lot of you know, research, and this is an experiment that's been tested over and over again, you know, since then. And so is it, are babies scared? Is it their depth perception that they're learning? You know, why is it that babies, you know, at first start to crawl over this and then at some point stop? And, you know, so what's the reasoning behind that is what they, you know, wanted to discover with this visual cliff experiment. So this will come up in the human development chapter as well. And then if you ever take a lifespan class too, it comes up in there. More on the Gestalt law of perception, or theory of visual perception. The Gestalt theorists were the first group of psychologists to systematically study perceptual organization around the 1920s in Germany. So Johann Wolfgang was one of them. Ernest Mach was another one. Who's another one? Wertheimer was another one. Kohler was another one. Kafka was another one. Kurt Lewin. The coming to power of National Socialism at the time substantially interrupted the fruitful scientific development of Gestalt theory in the German-speaking world. And so Kafka, Wertheimer, and Kohler, as well as Lewin, emigrated, or they were forced to flee to the United States, rather, where they continued to work in spite of the dominant theoretical field for that time of behaviorism. So Gestalt means, you know, when parts identified individually have different characteristics to the whole, right, the organized whole. So when we describe a tree in parts, we have the trunk, the branches, the leaves, you know, the blossoms like the flowers or something, or fruit sometimes. But when you look at an entire tree, you're not necessarily, you know, naming or aware of all the parts to the tree, or the insides to the tree, or all the rings, you know, in the trunk as the tree ages. You know, parts are secondary importance, even though they can be, you know, clearly seen. Figure ground is a rather simple dichotomy that literally defines our ability to visually separate elements based on the contrasts, such as light and dark, black and white, which is what we see here. We best understand things in duality, and our visual perception is no different. We see things that are bright when especially contrast against something dark or dull, and we understand the figure or focus of an artwork better if the background is plain and simple. Effective figure-ground relationships are when the audience can clearly identify a figure as a distinct object that separates from the compositional background. Figures are considered positive compositional elements, while the space or ground around it is considered opposite, a negative compositional element. The handling of a figure-ground relationship is about finding balance between these elements that suits your design and messaging. A classic example of ambiguous figure-ground relationship is Edgar Rubin's vase, which is what you see here. This iconic image shows black positive space from two profiles of human faces staring at each other, while the inverse negative space forms a vase. The ambiguity of object and ground leave interpretation up to the viewer. As Rubin summarized in his research, when two fields have a common border and one is seen as figure and the other as ground, the immediate perceptual experience is characterized by a shaping effect, which emerges from the common border of the fields and which operates only on field or operates more strongly on one than the other. However, if a figure dominates its surround ground, the clarity of a subject can be viewed as boring or as a boring design that lacks visual nuance. Toying with the borders between figure and ground is where creativity often lies, especially as contrast and scale play a key role in tricking audiences' eyes and perception. The principle of proximity states that we tend to perceive elements as a group when they're close to each other. We also look at this idea that it's compelling and often overrides when other attributes such as shape and color, such as what we see here, or other factors are added that can differentiate an object or a group of objects. However, when it comes to graphic designs, this principle of proximity means that objects are near each other, are often seen as a unit, meaning designers can use this principle to create relationships between objects to help viewers understand the information that's presented. If we look at the smaller or the squares, one looks smaller than the other, and it's the color scheme, behind the black square or the white square being in the presence of the black background that's making the squares appear larger or smaller than what they are. So the area around it is deceptive in a way because of the color scheme. We often go to group things by similarity. So we use color to denote similarities in images, which is what we see here with the red and black circles, right? We see alternating columns. And if you were to throw a bag of M&Ms on the table, your mind would immediately start to group them by color. Red will be a group, green will be another, yellow another, blue another. So we're inclined to group elements that look like each other, hence the similarity idea. Another one of Gestalt's ideas is this law of uniform connectedness. If we're looking at this image on the right, we automatically see them as belonging to each other because there's this line that connects them, right? This uniform connectedness. The law states that elements that are connected to each other by color or lines, frames, or any other means are perceived as related and grouped rather than elements with no connection. That means that elements must have some common characteristic and be linked by each other with one feature in order to be visually recognized as belonging to the same group. Uniform connectedness creates a stronger connection between group objects than what we see with the proximity and or similarity. It can redefine groups that are already established by other principles. The law of uniform connectedness is one of the Gestalt laws of grouping. So these laws describe how the human eye perceives visual elements as a single form or group rather than as separate elements. Gestalt psychologists argue that certain principles of design exist because the mind has an innate disposition to perceive patterns based on these categories, such as the proximity, similarity, closure, as well as the connectedness. So this discusses the law of focal point. When we're looking at Kandinsky's painting, you most likely notice this dark circle in the upper left-hand side. So this is the focal point. And so the entirety, point in the painting is this. This is what captures your attention first, and then your eyes flow to the rest of the picture that's here. The continuation can carry through both positive and negative spaces in the design. Positive space is a space in a design that's made up of the subject or the image that we insert. Negative space is the rest of the space around and in between the object's edges. When we view a design or a layout, our eyes tend to draw a line that connects different elements. Moving into subliminal messages. So these have been a little bit of conspiracy theory type ideas, controversy over subliminal messages. I'm sure you've heard about subliminal messages in Disney movies, commercials, ads, things like that. It's suspected and usually tested in psychological studies that subliminal messages gain their potential ability to influence from the fact that they may be able to circumvent the conscious awareness at its critical functions. For example, if you're listening to a subliminal message session for weight loss and you're able to hear the affirmations, I am slim and trim, your conscious mind would say to itself, what a load of crap. I'm fat, I hate my body. The idea is that since you're unable to criticize the affirmation when you cannot consciously hear it, it's accepted by the subconscious mind without comment or, any thought process, right? Because it's in your subconscious mind. So this route to influence, or persuasion to the autosuggestion or hypnosis, wherein the subject is encouraged to be relaxed so that suggestions are directed to deeper parts of the mind. Some observers have argued that the unconscious mind is incapable of critical refusal of any hypnotic or subliminal suggestions. Research findings, though, don't support the conclusion that subliminal messages or suggestions are powerful. Although this might be because most of the studies into subliminal suggestions or influence involve a one-off subliminal stimulus, and then behavior is measured to test any influence. Usually if all the response of subjects is small and weak, so for example, people are asked to look at a computer screen and stimulus subliminal cue, like the word or an image of a cloud, something is presented. Afterwards, subjects are asked to select from a list of words or images, and the hope is that the subliminally presented cue will be selected more often. This, of course, does not reflect the purpose of a subliminal message or suggestion, recording, which presents the affirmations, repeating it hundreds of times during the period the session is played. It's assumed that the small effect shown in studies is increased with the repetition, but that's not always the case when we look at subliminal messages. So an absolute threshold is the minimum amount of energy that's needed for a person to be able to detect something. If a stimulus falls beyond the threshold, the person does not experience it. Under ideal circumstances, a person's absolute thresholds are very low. The problem is that there's so much noise around people, they can't detect half the stimuli that's confronting them. So noise is the term given to irrelevant or competing stimuli. So you can see the clock here. So in order to measure the absolute threshold, psychologists have arbitrarily decided to use the criterion of detecting the stimulus 50% of the time. So in the graph, the person's absolute threshold for detecting the ticking clock is at a distance of 20 feet. So that's how far from the clock they are in order for them to, hear it half the time. You can see there's different thresholds for our 5 senses, different amount of distance for what we can see or feel or hear or taste. So these thresholds show an amazing power of our senses to detect, even slight variations in our environment. You can see taste, like a teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water, we can taste that. Even though it's a very small amount, we can taste the difference in that. The eye is set up like a camera, so it's able to essentially like take a picture of the world. The sclera is the white outer part of the eye that gives the eye its shape and protects the eye from any kind of injury. The iris is the colored part of our eye. The pupil appears black in the opening in the center of the iris. The iris contains muscles that allow the pupil to grow larger or smaller depending on how much light is being let into the eye. The cornea is the clear membrane on the outer part of the eye, and the curved surface of the cornea bends light on the surface of the eye in order to focus it to the back of the eye. And then the lens is transparent and somewhat flexible. So when a person is looking at an object that's far away, the lens has a relatively flat shape. However, when a person is looking at a closer object, more bending of the light is needed, which is done by the lens. And then we have the retina, that's multi-layered sensitive surface that records when a person sees and then converts it to a neural impulse for processing in the brain. It's the primary mechanism for sight. Rods are sensitive to light and allow a person to see at night, but are not very useful for color vision. Cones are used for color perception and are not very helpful at night. We don't have the fovea on here, but the fovea is the center of the retina. It contains only cones and is important to many visual tasks. Rods and cones transduce light into electrochemical impulses that go to the bipolar cells and then move on to the ganglion cells. And then the axons of the ganglion cells make up the optic nerve. The optic nerve cells, the optic nerve carries visual information to the brain, and then the blind spot on the retina contains neither rods nor cones. After light passes through the cornea, the pupil, and the lens, it falls on the retina. So there's 3 layers of specialized cells in the retina that convert the image into a neural signal that can be transmitted to the brain. First, the light triggers a reaction in the rods and cones at the back of the retina, transducing light into energy into electrochemical neural impulses. These neural impulses activate the bipolar cells, which in turn activate the ganglion cells, and then light information is transmitted to the optic nerve, which conveys it back to the brain. The arrow here indicates the sequence in which light information moves in the retina. Color is a pattern of neural responses that generate color vision. The process of color perception starts in the retina, the eye's film. The trichromatic theory states that color perception is produced by 3 types of cone receptors. The term color blindness refers to the ability to see some colors but not others. We see in the images here, there's the normal color on the left, and then the color deficient, which is the dichromat, on the right. Color blindness depends on which of the 3 kinds of cones, green, red, and blue, is inoperative. Afferimages are sensations that remain after a stimulus is removed. The opponent process theory states that cells in the visual system respond to complementary pairs of red, green, and blue, yellow colors. A given cell might be excited by red and inhibited by green, whereas another cell might be excited by blue and inhibited by yellow. So this slide gives you some percentages on the likelihood that some of these conditions will pass through the genes. These are the hereditary color deficiencies that can pass from one generation to the next. So do you see the numbers that are visual here, or are you not able to read them? So the numbers are, like, people with normal vision are able to see on the left-hand circle the number 8. The number on the right would be the number 5 in the circle. People that have a red-green color blindness may just see the number 8, or just the number 5, or they might not see either one. A complete colorblind assessment involves the use of 15 different stimuli. So you would answer more than just the 2 that we see here. On entering the outer ear, sound waves travel through the auditory canal where they generate vibrations in the eardrum. These vibrations are transferred via the hammer, anvil, and stirrup to the fluid-filled cochlea in the inner ear. There, the mechanical vibrations are converted into electrochemical signals that the brain will recognize as sound. The outer ear is called the pinna, which is the ear that people can see, the part of the ear that people can see. It's what you pierce to wear earrings, if your friend whispers into your ear to tell you a secret. You know, its main job is to collect sounds. Sound comes into the inner ear as vibrations when it enters the cochlea, which is a small curled tube in the inner ear. You know, cochlea is filled with liquid, you know, which is set into motion like a wave. So when the ossicles vibrate, as the sound as the vibrations come into the cochlea. The cochlea is also lined with tiny cells covered in tiny hairs. They're so small you would need a microscope to see them. When sound reaches the cochlea, the vibrations or the sound cause the hairs on the cell to move, creating nerve signals that the brain understands as sound. So when you hear your favorite song on the radio, that's the little hairs in the cochlea moving. In the middle ear, after the sound waves enter the outer ear and they travel through the ear canal, they make their way to the middle ear. The middle ear's main job is to take those sound waves and turn them into vibrations that are delivered to the inner ear. To do this, it needs the eardrum, which is a thin piece of skin that is stretched tight like a drum. So this is more of a closer image of the cochlea. This spiral structure consists of the fluid-filled canals. When the stirrup vibrates against the oval window, the fluid in the canals vibrate. Vibrations along portions of the basilar membrane correspond to different sound frequencies. The vibrations exert pressure on the hair cells. The hair cells in turn push against the tectorial membrane, and then this pressure bends the hairs. This triggers an action potential in the auditory nerve. So we have a few other senses, our skin senses, our chemical senses, and our kinesthetic and vestibular senses. The skin senses, our sense of touch, is our largest sensory system because we have receptors for touch, for temperature, for pain. We detect mechanical energy or pressure against the skin. Note that our sensitivity to touch is not equally good in all areas of the skin. For temperature, we have thermoreceptors. These are sensory nerve endings under the skin to respond to changed temperatures. It provides inputs to keep the body temperatures regulated at about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, though everybody's slightly different on that. It helps to, recognize warm, hot, cold. We have pain, which is the sensation that warns an individual of damage to the body. We have intense stimulation of any one of the senses that can produce pain. There's receptors that are dispersed widely throughout the body and have a high threshold for firing. There's the fast neural pathway that provides immediate information about an injury. There's the slow neural pathway that reminds the brain that an injury has occurred. And then we have chemical senses. These are our taste and our smell. These bumps on the tongue for our taste, called the papilla, contain the taste buds or the receptors for taste. These include sweet, bitter, salty, sour, a umami, which is a savory flavor. The smell is the lining of the roof of the nasal cavity. This is a olfactory. This contains a sheet of receptor cells for smell. And then we have our kinesthetic and vestibular senses. The kinesthetic ones provide information about movement, posture, and orientation. These are embedded in muscle fibers and joints. Our vestibular sense provides information about balance and movement. The kinesthetic senses and the vestibular sense, they work together to coordinate our Just overall proprioceptive feedback. This is information about the position of our limits, body parts in relation to other body parts. And that about wraps up the different senses for these. We have these semicircular canals also. These are 3 fluid-filled circular tubes that are in the inner ear, containing the sensory receptors that detect head motion. So when you move your head, your perception of the movement and position is determined by how the fluid flows in different directions and different speeds. So our perceptions of our bodies are flexible, right? This proprioceptive drift refers to the perception that something other than our actual body is part of our body.